Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Los Alamos Historical Society Lecture Series. This is a special kickoff to the 2015-2016 lecture year series. My name is Todd Ervetch. I'm on the board of the Historical Society, program chair. The lecture series this year, the theme is 70 years since the end of World War II. And in this week, as you know, has been a special 70 years anniversary of several things. Now, tonight, of course, our lecturer is a special guest, but we also have another special guest. And I would like for him to stand up. His name is Michael DeLello. He is the Deputy Cabinet Secretary of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. Let's give him a big round of applause. He toured a bunch of places here today, and he says he's coming back, and I just talked to him now, and we had dinner with him earlier tonight, and he seems like a great guy. So welcome him, research him. He's got a great history. Look on the web, look him up. Michael DeLello. Okay, thanks, Michael, for being here. I would like to take a poll to see when each of you, and I'm going to go by decades, speaking of decades, when each of you discovered Los Alamos. Okay? Raise your hand if you discovered Los Alamos in the 2010s. 20-aughts. 19, and feel free to look around at your fellow audience members. Where was it? 1990s. 1980s. 1970s. 1960s. 1950s. Gene, are you getting all of this on backbeat? Okay, good. Where was I? 50s. Goodness. 1940s. Really? Okay, just to be complete, 1930s. Okay. All right, interesting. Okay, good. All right, tonight, so I'm not a statistician despite all these things that I like to do. Tonight we're very honored to have with us the New Mexico State historian. He received his BA from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1977. And this is why I did this study, because our lecturer is not originally from New Mexico. He got his PhD from the University of New Mexico in 1985. He's a former editor of the Vargas Project at the University of New Mexico. This was a very interesting project. He worked on it for about 17 years, from like 1982 to the year 2000, and they produced 7 volumes. And this is on the New Mexico governor who led the reconquest, 1692. After the conclusion of the Vargas Project, he worked at the New Mexico State University, most notably on the Durango microfilming project. So now what is, I just gave you a hint, what is the most durable form of archived material?
Clay.
I know, microfilm.
Microfilm. Yeah, well, okay. And how many years do you think that lasts? Take a guess. Somebody guess. More? 500. That's exactly right. Okay. So at New Mexico State University, our lecturers tonight also taught courses in colonial Latin America and Mexican history. He's written extensively on the history of the American Southwest and Mexico. Our lecturer is a soccer ref, very, very accomplished soccer ref. He's a dog lover. He has 2 dogs, a lab heeler and a husky. And his permanent home is in Las Cruces. And so he does a lot of driving back and forth between Santa Fe and Las Cruces, and that's where he says that he does most of his writing while he's writing. Everyone, let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Rick Hendricks.
By way of clarification, not writing this way, but writing this way. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm a Spanish colonial historian, but Los Alamos is one of my favorite cities in the world. It's got a fascinating history. There was a radio interview this morning, and somebody asked me what my interest was in the Second World War. And I told a little story. My father was teaching physics in Milwaukee, and the military offered him the opportunity to come to New Mexico or to go to Utah. And he chose to go to Utah, and he was at Dugway Proving Ground. Did a lot of work with some really nasty stuff like mustard gas and phosgene. But I've always had an interest in the Second World War because he was involved in it. And one of his passions was reading the books of Cornelius Ryan. If any of you know The Longest Day, A Bridge Too Far, The Battle for Berlin, those books, he read them over and over and over, even though he was never in that theater. So I've always had an interest in the war. I also am going to take a poll. I'd like to know how many of you grew up in New Mexico. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to pretend to do is tell you what New Mexico was like in the Second World War and what its participation was. And I want to share with you some of the culture history as well of New Mexico at that time. And I want to start with an idea, and that is that New Mexico in the Second World War was living in a time of uncertainty. No one who has experienced a modern war, by that I mean a post-World War, post-Second World War, has had the experience of the level of uncertainty that people lived with during that time. Any of you who are alive know what I'm talking about, but it was especially true for New Mexico because of this. New Mexico sent 200th Coast Artillery to the Philippines, and in the early days of the war, when the Japanese captured the Philippines, and we had roughly 1,800 men that were there serving. And after a few months of battle, they were captured, and then they participated in what we've come to know as the Bataan Death March. And I understand you're going to have a speaker, someone who was a participant. So for New Mexico, that uncertainty that comes with war was particularly poignant for these people because after their sons were captured, sons and husbands and lovers and whatever were captured, they didn't have virtually no word. And one of the things that happened was that people from all over New Mexico would write letters to Governor Miles and ask about their loved ones. This one is from Socorro, New Mexico, dated December 27th, 1942. Dear sir, since December 24th, 1941, I have not heard anything nor know anything about my son, whose name and last address is the following: Private Ignacio Baca, 200th Coast Artillery, Fort Slotzenberg, Pampanga, Philippine Islands. If you can do anything to help me get some information about him, I would surely appreciate it. Yours truly, Cerrito Baca. The archives are full of these letters of people writing the governor asking for some information about their loved ones. And for the case of Cerrito Baca, word came June 22nd, 1943, that his son, PFC Ignacio Baca, had died at a prison camp in Asia that the War Department had reported. So from the time he last heard from him, which was in December of 41 until June of 43, he didn't know, and that was a fairly common story. In the case of Baca, he was one of the ones that was taken out of the Philippines, transferred on what they refer to as a hell ship to Manchuria, and he died in a prisoner of war camp in Manchuria. So this story was repeated and repeated and repeated 900 times for New Mexicans. Now, New Mexicans at war, we had the highest volunteer rate of any of the 48 states. We had between 50,000 and 54,000 volunteers and enlisted people. Also, and these were primarily, they were men, but at Alamogordo Army Airfield, we had a unit of WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. They flew B-17s and C-47s and other planes, 6 other different types of planes. And they would basically, they were flying transport. There were 1,100 of them. And it wasn't until the 1970s that these women were recognized as veterans. So they were discriminated against. 25,000 women applied to get one of these positions and only 1,100. So you had to be a pretty crackerjack pilot to get the opportunity to do that. New Mexico suffered the highest casualty rate of any state in the Union. Now, part of that was because our soldiers at Bataan suffered a 50% casualty rate. And those of you who know anything about military casualty rates, that's an incredible number, but that's why. But we had that distinction. Total losses, this is a number I calculated. There are a lot of different numbers. The National Archives has one number, but this is what I calculated. It's surprising to me in a certain sense that we don't actually know a definitive number, but 2,612 casualties. Here in Los Alamos, you're probably keenly aware that the Second World War was also a time of silence in New Mexico. These posters were everywhere. It was a time of secrecy. Obviously here, but so here is a picture of the gate. Of course, you're all familiar with that. And here's a poster, a billboard. This is actually from Oak Ridge. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. I don't know. Can anybody tell me if you had these ones here? They were all over Oak Ridge. I imagine there must have been something very similar here, if not one exactly like this, but this idea, and of course, I'm not going to tell you about Los Alamos. You know more about Los Alamos than I ever will know, but certainly the idea that this was a secret facility and that it was important to keep that secrecy was something that was very much alive. And of course, a lot of people obviously didn't know what was going on up here on the hill. Navajo code talkers, right? One of our great secrets, the secret wasn't really completely revealed until 1968, the role that the Navajo code talkers had played. They themselves were told that they were not allowed to tell their families about it. At the time, there were supposedly only 4 people in the Japanese Empire who knew Navajo. These were basically university types linguists. And my understanding is that they did recognize the language to be Navajo, but they certainly couldn't do anything with the code. The code was used in the Second World War. It was used again in Korea and even in Vietnam. Some of you probably are experts on it. The code had a couple of different features. It had a letter substitution. So the Navajo word would substitute for the letter C when they were spelling something out. So that was one way the code worked. And another way that the code worked was that they had words in Navajo that had translations that then were, that had a meaning associated with them. So it's pretty interesting, and I know enough about Navajo to know that you have to be very careful how you pronounce that word, because if you don't pronounce it, you say something very ugly. But this was a code that was for all practical purposes unbreakable, even though they had some recognition that it was in fact Navajo. So that was another thing that it was very much a secret, and it was very important in the Pacific. Now, just as an aside, there were other Native American languages that were used as codes in the war. Comanche was used in the European theater, and as far as I know, it wasn't broken either. Now, one of the things that was happening in New Mexico during the war was that we had military installations all over the place. So we had 8 major air bases, 5 dispersal bases. We had lots of gunnery ranges, bombing ranges, hospitals. We had actually more than 2 camps. We'll talk a little bit about it. We already had national cemeteries, some of them dating from the 1860s. POW camps. We had a lot of branch POW camps, smaller ones. We had programs in the colleges and universities. So we had virtually all over the state of New Mexico, we had some type of military installation. This is Camp Roswell, and of course it's too small for you to see, but lined up on the runway, these are all B-17s. Okay, so it was a major installation. We also had ROTC units. For the life of me, I don't know why we had the Navy at UNM. You can imagine on the Rio Grande maybe. And then New Mexico College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, what's today NMSU, had Army ROTC, and those were very active programs. They also did a lot of pilot training down south. So in terms of camps, we had a variety of different kinds of camps. We have a much greater awareness now that there was Japanese internees in Santa Fe. If you know the Santa Fe area where the big, wonderful dog park is now, it's that general area. Roswell had German and Italian POWs. They had 4,800 German POWs, almost all from the Africa Corps. And it was, we had some of the largest POW camps in the country here. Lordsburg, this story was kept under wraps until the early 1960s. Japanese internees, Italian and German POWs. Now, we had other facilities. These were the main ones that we had here. And there's been a lot of work done on the Japanese camps. This is from the Santa Fe Japanese internment camp. And then this wonderful drawing that was done. And again, if you know that area, on the other side of that ridge and then down the hill is Santa Fe in this area. There were primarily families and internees, Japanese and Japanese Americans, that were confined here, although there apparently were at least a few POWs. But generally it was not for that. There were some other places in New Mexico where Japanese families were interned. The railroad workers were kept for a while at Camp Baca, which is in Lincoln National Forest. So we had a variety of places where these people... Now, not every community in New Mexico sent its Japanese residents to the camps. We also had... This is prisoner of war exchange coupons from Roswell. Primarily in the southern part of New Mexico, they were performing agricultural labor. That was why they were sent there, and that's mostly what they were doing. These are German POWs at Fort Stanton. That was another location. Now, population figures. We generally look at New Mexico in the war era, and it's the period that sets off the largest and most dramatic demographic change in the history of New Mexico. Most of the change doesn't really happen until the 1950s, but the motor for it is the experience in the war. So if we look at the population in 1940, on the eve of the war, Albuquerque, 35,000, Santa Fe, 20, Las Vegas, 12, pretty small cities. One of the things that you see that happens is movement out of the villages, particularly of northern New Mexico. This is a phenomenon that we associate exclusively with the Second World War. It actually happened to a smaller extent in the First World War, that many people left their villages and had never been outside of New Mexico or never even been out of their home community. But this happened very dramatically during the war. People went into the military, obviously, but a lot of people, a lot of Native American people in particular, went to West Coast factories. Some estimate as much as 1/5 of the Hispanic population of New Mexico left their home communities for good as a result of the war and post-war experience. And this is when we really get the rise of the New Mexico cities. Albuquerque becomes the behemoth that it is. Most capital cities are a little bit bigger than Santa Fe is today, but New Mexico, people moving off the land and moving into the cities. One of the things that really happens that's quite important in terms of culture history is what I would refer to as the explosion of the tricultural myth. It used to be, even when I moved to New Mexico in the late 70s, people would talk about New Mexico being a tricultural state, meaning that we had Native Americans, we had Hispanics, and we had Anglos, right? Those were the three elements. Well, that was never even true in the Spanish colonial period, right? But in the war years, you really see what I'm calling here the subcultures really start to stand out. Pueblo, Navajo, Hispanic villages. There's a lot of LDS settlement along the San Juan River, and their European enclaves, particularly the Italians in Albuquerque. Now, in the history of immigration to New Mexico, always and forever and probably always in the future, the number one group is what? Number one group of immigrants to New Mexico is always from where? Mexico, right? Always. Even immediately after the war with Mexico, we still got more immigrants from Mexico. But at various times, the group that comes in second changes. Sometimes it's Germans, Irish, English, and occasionally Italians. So we had a lot of immigration and that settled in Albuquerque. Typically, when they moved out of Italy, they were moving off the land. And when they arrived in the United States, they didn't want to work the land anymore, and so they got into other occupations. A lot of Anglo-American ranchers from the south, so the southern part of New Mexico in particular, because immigration in the United States tends to be from east to west directly, just straight across, and so there are lots and lots of communities in southern New Mexico where people talk a lot like I do. And of course, we had communities of Japanese truck farmers. We had very well established Japanese truck farmers in the Las Cruces area, and there were also some in the Socorro area. And in the Las Cruces area, they didn't go to any camps. They stayed on the land primarily. And so I always like to tell the story of Roy Nakayama. The Nakayama family was heavily involved in truck farming in the Las Cruces area. He was born in the Mesilla Valley. You see him sitting there holding chilies if you're close enough. Those are the chilies that we make into chili relleno, okay? And Roy Nakayama was responsible for the development of that chili. And his family is one of the Japanese-American families that resided in New Mexico, that avoided going to an internment camp, and he made a great contribution to our state. That's our iconic chili, and he worked for many years at NMSU. Now, religion in the period was primarily Hispanic Roman Catholic, but most of the priests were French and Irish. Right? Part of this was due to discrimination against the idea of supplying priests from Mexico. So, and we also had a long-standing tradition of having French priests. So primarily French and Irish. There were a few Germans, and then of course in the Anglo community there were a lot of Presbyterians and Methodists. Of course, we have Baptists and everybody, but that's a little bit surprising that we had a lot of Hispanic people worshiping, and a lot of times the priest didn't speak the language very well. So during the war, prior to the war, the mineral industry in New Mexico was somewhat in decline, and during the war, there was a great demand for the minerals, both metallic and non-metallic, that were produced in New Mexico. And you can see the rankings, first in potash and tantalum and pumice, and then on down, zinc and tin, copper, molybdenum, vanadium, beryl, lithium. These are all things that are more strategic. They have to do with, they're associated with weaponry and hardening of steel and all those kinds of things. And they became very important in New Mexico during that period, whereas they weren't really prior to that. Those were, for the 1940s, technically, those were significant metals. They're not all of them so much anymore. And of course, a lot of them have very different uses now. Several of these now you can get in a multivitamin. And they used to be used to like harden steel in an airplane wing or something like that. So it's very different uses. One of the fundamental things that happens in New Mexico because of all this movement around on the people on the land and the change in the cities is that the environment changed very fundamentally in New Mexico. And the only place where most people believe that you can see what New Mexico looked like before the war, in our national forest, you can still find areas that look very much like what New Mexico was like. And then in the Valles Caldera, those are areas where you can sort of take a step back in time and see what New Mexico was like before all the change that happened because of the war. Now, I can't come to Los Alamos, I can't talk about the war without talking about bombs, right? And the coming together of great minds to create weapons is something that was important in time of war. And so, of course, I'm talking about the bat bomb. When I was putting together this lecture, I thought, well, I'll tell them about the bat bomb because nobody knows about the bat bomb. But actually, everybody, I think, knows about the bat bomb. A dentist who was vacationing, he's from Pennsylvania, he was vacationing at Carlsbad Caverns. He was aware that we had a superabundance of bats, and he came up with the idea. Now, you have to remember that Tokyo and most major Japanese cities were still made of wood, and his idea was that a small incendiary device would be attached to the bats. The bats would be in this canister. They would be dropped on Japan. They would fly into the eaves of the homes, and then they would, there was a timer, and it would set the homes in Japan on fire. They did a number of tests, and they used a lot of bats from New Mexico to do this because our Mexican bats are the ideal for this idea. They had an accident where one of the bombs destroyed the home of the base commander. And after spending $2 million on the project, they decided to drop it. What we did come up with in New Mexico, this is actually, Albuquerque is credited with this. This is a proximity fuse. Are there any artillery guys in the group? The idea is artillery, you used to shoot it at the target and it would explode when it hit the target, right? It's kind of a hit or miss proposition. The idea here is that there is a timer, and as the proximity to the target increases, proximity increases, then the shell can be timed to go off. And General Patton used this in Europe, And he said this was the greatest military invention that he had ever seen. It was very effective. And the English had been experimenting with this in the 1930s, but supposedly a proximity fuse that could be mass-produced reliably was actually developed in Albuquerque. And of course, the other ones you guys know way more about than I do. I was at a house earlier today where someone had a scale model made of I thought, okay, that's really a conversation piece, I suppose. Maybe only in Los Alamos would that be. Stand around the patio and... Oh, it's full size. It's not a scale model. Okay, I misunderstood. Okay, I should have known it would have been full size. This is the man who paid $200,000 for a latch or something? Okay, all right. Well, anyway, these bombs you know about. And this was Gadget. Okay, so another big important thing that happens is the change in agriculture in New Mexico. New Mexico primarily an agricultural state prior to the war. So one of the things that happens, and of course these were all over the place, you see share the meat, the promotion, eat meat once a week, or it's like, and then this one I love, eat more cottage cheese, right? New Mexico is and has been a huge dairy state, right? We rank, well, probably, I don't know about today, but up until recently, we were 7th in the country. Now, New Mexico is a dairy, no, Wisconsin is a dairy state. New Hampshire is a dairy state. But we've been a dairy state, so I really love this. And I'm sure you probably know the consumption of cottage cheese is basically disappearing. We've all switched over to yogurt. Greek yogurt is the fad now. And the main reason is not because people don't like it or it's not good for diet or whatever. It's really complicated to make cottage cheese. So anyway, eat cottage cheese, you'll need less meat. This is one of the World War II posters that's probably not as familiar as Loose Lips Sink Ships, but good anyway. Okay, some numbers. Before the war, 34,000 farms and ranches. During the war, acute labor shortage, right? Because the men are gone fighting. Many of the women are also gone. And one of the things that you see, Navajo women and children working everybody else's farms. This is also when we have the Bracero program, right? So we're bringing guest workers from Mexico to labor in our farms. We're thinking about it again, but and then German and Italian POWs primarily in the southern part of the state. Sheep and cattle. Wool production in New Mexico was on the decline before the war started, and then suddenly there's a demand for wool uniforms, right? And so wool production goes up, wool production goes up. Roswell warehouses shipping 3 to 5 million pounds a year. Sheep and mohair, this is for making clothing, right, is exceeding the value of cattle in New Mexico. So this is and then of course the Eat Meat Once a Day campaign. We get a big expansion of apple production in the northern part of the state, vegetables in the west, cotton in the south, and cotton is still an important product in the south. And the other thing that coincides, probably not driven by the war, but coincides with the war years, is that the college begins scientific breeding of agriculture, of livestock primarily. And they were also involved with plant breeding, but really to try to improve the herds of New Mexico, something that's going on in this period. And of course the Bracero program, thousands of Mexican farm workers come to do basically stoop labor in the United States because there wasn't really anybody to do that kind of work, and we needed it. Here's Americanos todos luchamos por la victoria. Americans all, let's fight for victory. Sombrero wielding Mexican and Uncle Sam, all right? So a very popular program. Although I'm sure you know that there are a lot of reparations claims by braceros who felt like they didn't get paid. Now, images of war. We always talk about how the Vietnam War was the first war to come into our living rooms, right? You hear that? Because it was on the television and we saw that. Well, this war was in everybody's living room and in everybody's newspaper. And of course, probably the foremost correspondent in the Second World War was Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle was not from New Mexico, but he called New Mexico home. He said he'd never really found any place that he liked better than Albuquerque. Didn't really care for Santa Fe or Taos, but he loved Albuquerque. And of course, he was killed tragically in the Pacific, but he was very much a booster of New Mexico. And of course, the other is Bill Mauldin, who was born in New Mexico, but by the time the war started, this biting cartoonist who was mostly for Stars and Stripes, he was living in Arizona, but we claim him here. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is Liberation of France, and the officer is getting hit in the back of the head with a tomato, and the caption is, "My, sir, what an enthusiastic weapon." And of course the enlisted man, welcome, the enlisted man is throwing the tomatoes. And what his whole thing was to show the enlisted man's, the common soldier side of the war. And it's a little bit surprising to me that Stars and Stripes let him do it. He had obviously a wicked sense of humor. And like I say, we claim him. He was born in Otero County. Now, I'll cross my fingers and hope this is going to work. There was also a soundtrack to the war.
That Japan has now cast Bataan. And just now comes the word from the President's office that a second air attack has been reported on Army and Navy bases in Manila. Thus, we have official announcements from the White House that Japanese airplanes have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and have now attacked Army and Navy bases in Manila. We return you.
So you can imagine what a chilling piece of news that was for people living in New Mexico, knowing that we had so many men 75 miles north of Manila, which was where they were. This is a slice daily typical radio programming in New Mexico in the 1940s during the war years. So you have a news program. Eileen Farrell was an operatic singer. Some of you may know her voice. News analysis. Then we had serial drama, what we came to be called soap operas, because the soap companies sponsored them, right? Remarkably, in the 1940s, there were 50 serial dramas running on the radio in the United States. 50. It's almost unbelievable. But they were interrupted, just as that interruption about the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Manila. And so we had a lot of music programs, romance, and actually the serials were considered to be fillers, right? They ran for 50 minutes, and if you have an interest in there, hundreds and hundreds of these are on YouTube, and you can listen to them. And war correspondence, a lot of big band music. And this was a typical day of radio in New Mexico. Now, this is not a full day, and oftentimes what the radio stations did in what they considered to be the off hours when they weren't going to sell so much advertising was that they gave that over for Spanish music, because typically the Latino population was not permitted to have a license to operate a radio station in the United States. So they tended to have to put things on the radio. So better off. So these were the songs. Those were the top songs, and then New Mexicans also love to listen to popular Mexican music. That's Trio Los Panchos, and this is, of course, Jorge Negrete. So these people were hugely popular. I've talked to a lot of people a lot of Hispanic New Mexicans whose parents were mad for the Mexican stars, and they saw the movies when they came out. And of course, motion pictures was really big, and there were newsreels that showed, and they gave war news. And these were movies that were popular during the war years. Citizen Kane, Casablanca, which of course has a war theme, Double Indemnity, and I'll Be Seeing You, which also has a war theme. As the war was going on, movies were being made and people were watching movies that incorporated war themes in them. And then the Hispanic population of New Mexico was wild about the Mexican movies. Here we have Jorge Negrete. Dolores Del Rio was extremely popular in Mexico, but also made movies in the United States. Maria Felix, probably one of the biggest Mexican stars, and Dolores Del Rio again. These movies were available to see here in New Mexico, and just to prove my point, Mission Theater in Albuquerque, they didn't get the title quite right. It's not Ay Jalisco No Terrajes, it's No Terrajes. But anyway, Jorge Negrete movies, and Pedro Infante, the other megastar of the Mexican. This is the Paris Theater in Santa Fe, and this is the Kiva, another Pedro Infante movie, and that was in Las Vegas. So these movies were available to the Hispanic population during the war years as well. So, okay. Now, I want to leave some time for some conversation, so I want to close with some remarks about the legacy of the war years. Again, this is something that was said after World War I. It was a popular song. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? But even more so in New Mexico in the Second World War. A lot of people had never had any exposure to being away from New Mexico. And so it wrought a fundamental change. Enshrined in the New Mexico Constitution is a provision that if you're part of a Native American community and you don't pay taxes, then you don't vote. Well, that was in the original form of the Constitution. What that meant for all practical purposes was none of the Pueblo Indians could vote. So Miguel Trujillo was a Marine veteran, and when he came back from the war, he said, I've been fighting for this country. I think I ought to be able to vote for this country. And so he challenged that, and in 1948, a federal three-man court made the decision to strike that provision from the Constitution. Now, it wasn't immediately taken out, but it did eventually happen. KOB is the first TV station between the Mississippi and the West Coast, 1948. My understanding that your radio station here that I spoke with this morning was also begun during the war years, which is, and of course we could talk all day about rocketry and space exploration and all of that, and how that came about in New Mexico. It's a hugely important story. It's a direct byproduct of the war. After the war, the Soviet Union and the United States were madly scrambling together, primarily German scientists, some Nazis, some not. Wernher von Braun is the name that most people know because he became a very popular figure and was on TV and popularized science and did all sorts of interesting things. He was a party member, so I don't know. But at any rate, the program that brought them over here that secreted the scientists out of Germany in competition for the Soviet Union really made it possible. They brought train car loads of V-2 rockets in pieces and reassembled them, and that's how the modern space industry really developed. And we have a wonderful museum in Alamogordo dedicated to that history, and if you haven't had a chance to see it, you certainly should if you get down that way. Of course, one of the most important, most significant legacies is the labs and the bases. Obviously, Los Alamos, Sandia, Kirtland White Sands Missile Range, hugely important to the country and the world in terms of scientific advancement. But let's face it, the federal dollars coming to New Mexico have been a lifeline for us that's hugely important. Farms declined by 13,000. So that's a very, very sharp, dramatic decline in people living on the land here in New Mexico. Most people consider the Second World War to be the most transformative event in modern New Mexico history. It's interesting, when we were celebrating the 100 years of being a state, we put together a number of timelines, and we really struggled to come up with events in the 20th century after some of the events of the Second World War. So, very transformative event. And the final thought that I would say with respect to New Mexico and the war is the war changed everything it touched in New Mexico, and it touched everything. Thank you. You want it on?
No, just give it to me. I'm going to take it around.
Okay. So if you have questions for me, or if you'd like to share some of your experiences for a minute or two, I don't know how much time we have, some time anyway.
This crowd can last all night.
Yes.
What was Japanese truck farming?
Well, do you know what truck farming is? Okay. Truck farming is basically the production of vegetables for market, what we might call market to table nowadays. It was a production of vegetables, and it was something that's very traditional in the Japanese community, the kind of loving care with vegetables, and so they're known for being able to produce very high quality vegetables. And so that truck farming, that concept of that kind of agricultural production, in other words, it's not industrial scale, it's smaller scale, but it's still production for market. It was dominated in the Mesilla Valley by a couple of Japanese American families. Most of the kids were born in the United States, but I think in both cases, one or both parents had been born in Japan and had come over and settled in the Mesilla Valley. So, yeah. Yes?
Your first part talked about Bataan Death Mark, the secrecy, unknown aspect of thing here. When did the horrors of the Bataan Death Mark actually become broadly known?
Well, it wasn't, primarily it wasn't until after, news began to come out towards the end of the war. After about 2.5 years, we started to get some information. But the true horrors, I don't think, really became known until the war was over. I think, and generally speaking, I think we know more about Bataan here in New Mexico for obvious reasons than is generally known everywhere else. For example, our school children tend to learn about Bataan as one of sort of the fundamental things that they learn about the war, or maybe even the history of the state. But I don't think it's as widely known, in other parts of the country. Some places for sure know, but not necessarily everywhere the way we do here. Yeah, there have been a couple of movies, but again, it's something that's always in the forefront. The Bataan building in Santa Fe has a permanent exhibit, so if you have to do government business in that building, you can't escape. There's an eternal flame that's outside. We have a ceremony every year recognizing it, and we still have a few survivors. So I think generally speaking, it's something. And of course, again, I mean, it contributes to that horrific casualty rate, which is pretty much unprecedented in modern warfare. John? Yeah, well, just like that item in the news, there were occasionally things, but a lot of the postcards and things that like the Red Cross, you were limited to a certain number of characters, and a lot of it, because the Japanese were reading it, a lot of it is just like, we're fine, we're being treated really well, all that stuff. I mean, at least it let people know that they were alive. Yeah, yes?
You mentioned there was a lot of Mexican nationals who came to work in New Mexico.
Right.
Do we have any similar situations to the Zoot Suit riots they had in California?
There were some Zoot Suit. I'm not really like in California, but the Zoot Suits really started in El Paso. That's where that whole movement started and where that style of dress started. I was just reading an article the other day about it that was saying that the police were not as concerned with them, and they were referencing what had happened in California because they said that people are, their own people are making fun of them for the way they act and the way they dress. So there was some police concern, but I don't think it was anything like at that scale. Anybody else? Anybody want? Yes, sir.
Was there any? Excuse me. I was wondering, was there any special connection between the state and the battleship USS New Mexico during the war?
Special connection? Well, yeah. Anybody who is, especially if they had, if there were people from New Mexico that served, because there's a long-standing tradition in New Mexico of trying to keep people supplied with green chili. And that's a tradition that, my understanding, still carries forward into the modern era. So, yeah, I suppose it would be more important to you if you happened to be from New Mexico and you ended up serving on that craft. There would be a special connection. And I know for a fact that people who served on the ship, I know they came to Mesilla after the war because they went to La Posta, the restaurant that's in Mesilla, and they keep a book where they write visitors. And there were people who had been on the ship, and they had heard all these wonderful things about New Mexico. They weren't from New Mexico, but their experience was serving on the ship, and so they wanted to come see New Mexico. So that's kind of a special connection. Maybe bring tourist dollars.
Can you tell us more about how the Navajo code was used in the Korean and the Vietnamese War? I never could find anything about that.
I don't really know any details about how it was used. All I'm aware of is that it was used. I don't really know how they used it. In the Second World War, they were often using it for spotters for artillery. They would say, they would describe an aircraft or they would describe a position, and that's why they had all those little names for planes or for animals, like a tank being a turtle and that sort of thing. And they would call it, and they would call in the coordinates, and then the artillery would zero in on it. So they were using it a lot for that. I would imagine. And now that you've asked that question, I'm going to try to find out too. I would imagine they would have done it for artillery spotting because that seemed to be what it was really effective for. It was very dangerous to be in that position, right? You're exposed, you're with a radio, You know, and you're concentrating on trying to relay that kind of information back instead of, you know, manning a machine gun or something. You know, so it was a risky operation. I'm guessing that's what they did, but I really don't know. But the information has to be out there somewhere. Yeah.
Not really a question, but similar to Oak Ridge's sign, I saw one here that was simpler, that just said, what you learn here when you leave here, let it stay here.
Yeah, I suspect that they, but I mean, what I've read is that they had the same kind of signage, but if you go to Oak Ridge, I mean, the Historical Society here has an amazing website, but they have a website for Oak Ridge that seems to have mined a lot of pictures. I know you have wonderful pictures here too. And probably the pictures would answer that question. But for Oak Ridge, they put a lot of the images from Oak Ridge during the war, and they have lots and lots of those signs. There is a comment that says that they had them here and they had them at Hanford too. I don't know because I couldn't actually make the connection, but I bet they had something similar here because that was a big part of it, you know. Yes.
Oak Ridge was 60,000 people.
Pardon? Pardon?
You couldn't hide Oak Ridge with 60,000 people.
Yeah, but I mean, the signs were not to hide the messages were for the people that work in, yeah,
Sheer numbers.
yeah, yeah.
All right, that was wonderful. Thank you. Let's all give a big round of applause for Dr. Rick Hendricks. So if you want to come up and ask Dr. Hendricks questions, please feel free, or escort him out for refreshments in the Curtis room. Thank you everyone for coming, and pick up a schedule for the rest of the lecture series this year. Thank you everyone, and thank you Dr. Hendricks.